Right, so I think we have the waiting room emptied. We're going to get started. So hello, everyone. My name is Abby Currier, and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at the History Center of Olmsted County. I'm so excited to see everyone on here tonight, and I look forward to hearing more this evening about Alice and her time in France. Here at the History Center of Olmsted County, we invite people to gather, socially distanced of course, and explore and examine our past as we educate ourselves about the stories of Olmsted County and southeastern Minnesota. We are so excited that you have decided to join us tonight as we take a look at one of these stories. Tonight, we're going to have a presentation from Nancy O'Brien Wagner on Alice O'Brien, a young woman from Minnesota who served her country in a variety of ways during World War I. After a presentation, we will have about 15 minutes for questions from the audience. During the presentation, feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can. But before we get started, I just wanted to go over a couple of logistical things. For tonight, we are going to ask to keep all of you muted so that we can listen to our speaker. Like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can. We may also put some links in the chat throughout the night, so make sure that you keep an eye on it. Anything that we put into the chat, we will be sure to send to you tomorrow, along with a quick survey about tonight's program. It will take less than 2 minutes to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. We also recommend watching tonight's presentation in presenter view. But if you want to see everyone participating Brady Bunch style, you can do that by clicking on presentation view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. If you're joining us from an iPad, you may have to swipe a couple of times to be able to change the view. We will be recording tonight's program, so please keep that in mind. We are so excited about tonight's talk and hope that you will continue to join us for some of our future events, where we will get to talk about everything from wax models at the Mayo Clinic to women in World War II to voting rights and everything in between. These talks are one of the many great benefits to having a membership to the History Center of Olmsted County. We certainly hope that you will continue to join us for these talks, and we also hope that you will consider getting a membership to experience even more benefits. Tonight, we're joined by Nancy O'Brien Wagner, who is a partner at Blue Stem Heritage Group and has worked as a historian, writer, exhibit developer, and interpretive planner for over 20 years. Nancy has won awards for her work as an author and exhibit designer. Her article, Awfully Busy These Days, about the role of Minnesota Red Cross women in France during World War I, was a winner of the Solon J. Buck Award for Best Article in the Minnesota History magazine. This article was the foundation for her book, Alice in France, which was a finalist for the Minnesota Book Award. Nancy?
Thank you, Abby. Great. Do you want to pass over the power, or can I just go right ahead?
You should be able to share right now.
Okay, great. Here we go. There we go. All right. Is everyone seeing that lovely title page? All right. Welcome. Thank you, Abby. It was really great to be invited to join you tonight. I really appreciate the opportunity. And it's always fun to make history with a group of people. So I look forward to having more of a conversation at the end of this program. It's my first time giving this presentation through Zoom. So forgive me for the corny jokes. Usually I can make a corny joke and then people laugh. So I'm just going to pretend like there's a laugh track and you guys are laughing, or you can send little thumbs up or something. Please no frowny faces, but we're going to have a good time. So it's been about 4 years since this book came out, and what's been really fascinating to see is the way that the themes in this book keep coming back to haunt us. 4 years ago, when the book came out, it triggered conversations about globalism and authoritarianism and nationalism. Then it shifted to conversations about feminism and Me Too and the role of women in history. Most recently, of course, this history reflects the pandemic and the recent civil rights issues. So it keeps startling me how much history repeats, and I'm a historian. So it's really fun to see how these themes keep coming back. What I have learned, of course, through this realization is a greater appreciation for the persistence and grit of this generation of women. And I hope that you will appreciate hearing these stories too. So let's get started. I'd like to start by, here we go, by stepping back 104 years ago to the summer of 1914, and June 28th to be precise. 106 years ago, a spark was lit that ended up igniting a world war and eventually causing the deaths of around 20 million people. Back in middle school, you probably learned that World War I was triggered by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife, which isn't true, but as I like to point out, the first death of World War I was a woman, his wife, Sophie Chotek, who's the Duchess of Hohenberg. It's reported that she was pregnant and they were in love. And it's amazing to me to think that hers was the first death of those 20 million. But who killed the Duchess of Hohenberg and her husband? It was the Black Hand, what we would characterize as a terrorist group today. And what did they want? The unification of the Serbian people, autonomy, self-direction. They wanted to wrest control back from a group of distant elitist leaders. Tensions in the region had been extremely high for decades, and Germany's minister Otto von Bismarck had once said that one day the great European war will come out of some damn foolish thing in the Balkans. He was right. You know what? I'm going to have to pause for a second, pause my share, because I'm sorry about this. The slide that came up was the wrong one, which makes me wonder if I accidentally opened the wrong one. Sorry about that. Little technical difficulties. Yeah. All right, we're just going to go ahead. We don't need to have... No, we do. Hold on a second. I must have opened the wrong one. My apologies. I should have checked. I should have clicked farther, Abby, when we were going through it.
Okay. I keep like 1,000 PowerPoints on my computer and they're all named something almost the same.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's right, because these are named, one's Olmsted and one's Olmsted 220 or 2021. So, sorry about that. When was the draft one? Okay, I think we've got that figured out.
Oh, there's the quote you were reading.
I know. See, it's a good quote. It's worth trying to figure this out. Now I have to get it to go into the slide show. Play from current slide. Okay, there we go. All right, worth it, I think. Can you see this now? My great quote? Okay, Otto von Bismarck.
It is excellent.
There we go. So the assassination of Sophie and Franz set off this long chain of reactions. A complex set of previously established alliances meant that a declaration of war between two nations would trigger a larger war between multiple nations. Germany was allied with Austria-Hungary, Russia was allies with Serbia and France, England was allies with Belgium. So, unfortunately, on July 28th, just 1 month after the association of Sophie and Franz, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. On August 2nd, Germany occupied Luxembourg, and on the 4th, Germany invaded Belgium. War had begun. That same day, here in the United States, President Woodrow Wilson declared, "I venture, therefore, my fellow countrymen, to speak a solemn word of warning to you against that deepest, most subtle, most essential breach of neutrality, which may spring out of partisanship, out of passionately taking sides. The United States must be neutral in fact as well as in name during these days that are to try men's souls. We must be impartial in thought as well as action, must put a curb upon our sentiments as well as upon every transaction that might be construed as a preference of one party to the struggle before another." Brutal, brutal trench warfare ensued. But America stayed neutral. Generally, neutrality seemed like a good idea until May 1915, when Germany sinks the Lusitania, which was technically a passenger ship. The deaths of over 120 Americans really angered the American public, and opinions began to turn against Germany. Germany did not want to goad us into war, however, so they agreed to no longer torpedo neutral or passenger ships. So America stayed neutral, at least on paper, and stayed out of the war. Some Americans favored the Allied countries and some the Central Powers. For about 18 months, neutrality seemed to work. But then, in January 1917, the Zimmermann telegraph is decoded. Germany wants Mexico to ally against us and go to war. Then, Germany publicly announced that it would start torpedoing our ships again. They needed to, strategically. So, in March, they do. So between January and April 1917, American public opinion shifted dramatically against Germany and in favor of entering the war. On April 6th, when Wilson asked Congress to declare war, most Americans were in agreement, though not all. In the Senate, 6 senators voted against war. In the House of Representatives, 50 House of Representatives voted against it, including 4 of Minnesota's 10 congressmen. Republicans Harold Knudsen, Ernest Lundeen, and Charles Davis, and Democrat Carl Van Dyke. Also voting no was the first woman representative in Congress, Miss Jeanette Rankin of Montana. I wish to stand with my country, she said, but I cannot vote for war. Nonetheless, war was declared, and most Minnesotans stepped forward to do what they could. For men, the main question was whether to enlist or not. The National Defense Act of 1916 had authorized an expansion of the military, but in April 1917, when war was declared, the U.S. had an army of just 165,000, plus a National Guard of 181,000. That was a good start, but not enough for international war. Initially, Wilson hoped for an all-volunteer army, and 3 weeks after war was declared, around 97,000 men enlisted. I think that's an incredible statistics, but again, more were needed. So on May 18th, about a month and a half after the war had begun, a draft was instituted, initially requiring men from the ages of 21 to 30 to register. Over the next 20 months, around 4.8 million men joined the military, and 2 million, over 40%, enlisted voluntarily. I suspect we have a fair amount of people who are present who had grandfathers who served in the war. But this was not just a man's war. On the day that war was declared, women swamped the naval recruiting station in Minneapolis. The Minneapolis Tribune reported that women all over Minnesota and North Dakota are deluging the office of the Minneapolis Naval Recruiting Station with applications for enlistment as cooks, bookkeepers, telegraph and telephone operators, as stenographers and clerks. The response of the chief yeoman was, "Send on your men instead." It's amazing, but nevertheless, these women persisted. Approximately 25,000 American women served in Europe during the war, and 100% of them were voluntary. Around 5,600 of them were with the military as Army Corps nurses, Navy nurses, and Army Signal Corps telephone operators. Besides these 5,600 military women, there were another 19,500 who served as overseas civilian volunteers, many of them as unpaid workers. The Red Cross, Salvation Army, YWCA, and YMCA were well known, of course, but there were other groups too, such as the American Fund for French Wounded, the American Huguenot Committee, and the American Relief Clearinghouse. There were groups sponsored by Ivy League colleges and East Coast prep schools such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, St. Paul's, and Phillips Academy. In the end, there were about 100 of these smaller NGOs. At the time the United States entered the war in 1917, the roles of each of these different organizations was a bit unclear. But in February 1918, the Red Cross's official jurisdiction over the sick and wounded was confirmed. They were in charge of the hospitals. The other organizations, including the Red Cross, could continue to offer recreational, educational, and religious support to soldiers. Of the 25,000 women volunteers in France, about 15,000 worked for the Red Cross. They were the biggest game in town. Red Cross volunteers established 551 stations for which they offered service. Included were 24 hospitals and 12 convalescent homes for soldiers. They operated 130 canteens. They established emergency depots of medical supplies for the American Army and for French hospitals. The Red Cross also produced and supplied all necessary splints, nitrous oxide anesthetic, and oxygen for the Army. Beyond that, there was reconstruction and re-education efforts for crippled and disabled men, recreation and welfare service, hospital farms and gardens, moving pictures for hospitals, grave photography, civilian relief, relief of French soldiers' families, children's relief, and anti-tuberculosis relief. It is hard to overstate the importance of these efforts. Among the 15,000 women who were there were about 450 Minnesotan women. Most of those were nurses, but there were over 120 Minnesota women who signed up for a wide variety of non-nursing jobs. They were clerks, searchers, cantiners, social workers, drivers, nurses' aides, recreational volunteers, stenographers, secretaries, and chemists. Among those 120 women was one in particular whom I fancy, Alice M. O'Brien. In 1917, Alice was 26 years old. She was a remarkably adventurous woman, having grown up as the only daughter of William and Julia O'Brien. With her two brothers, Alice grew up in St. Paul among many wealthy and prominent families. Her father was a successful lumberman, first in Minnesota, then later Florida, the Carolinas, and the Bahamas. Alice attended the Bacchus School. After that, she went to Bennett Finishing School in Vermont, which was a typical path for someone like her. Photos from this era show Alice was an enthusiastic outdoorswoman. A newspaper described her as a young society girl who is known as an expert woman motorist. She is interested in all out-of-doors sports and is equally skillful at golf, tennis, cross-country riding, and hunting. Soon after her graduation from Bennett, the first hints of Alice's unconventional life began to appear. In 1911, the summer after her graduation, at just 19 years old, Alice and a group of friends, including Doris Kellogg, drove Alice's roadster to explore the American West. By this time, Alice had already developed her skills as a mechanic and driver. Family history recounts that her father taught her to drive by going up and down the driveway of her home, then up and down Summit Avenue. She taught herself about motors by taking apart her family's car and putting it back again together. In 1912, Alice traveled to Egypt and Europe with some girlfriends. She particularly enjoyed her time in France, and she was booked to return on the Titanic, but had to reschedule due to some mechanical issues with that vessel. Back in the United States, Alice joined the suffrage movement, advocating for the vote. In 1914, she was photographed in her car promoting a lecture by Christabel Pankhurst, the famous and influential English suffragist. As head of the Political Education Committee of the Women's Welfare League, which also included her friend Margaret Davis, Alice was responsible for engaging Miss Pankhurst and introduced her at the event. So let's pause and imagine what life might have been like for Alice 100 or so years ago. Can you imagine what this woman was like? She was smart. She was independent. She was clearly adventurous. She was an exceptionally good shot, according to the paper. What paths were there for women like Alice? She was 26 and single, an old maid by the standards of the era when the average marriage age for women was 22. Her friends were already married and having kids. What was there to do? Well, there was this war going on. Here's where Alice faced a choice. She could join the local Red Cross in St. Paul, wrap bandages, march in parades, raise money, and coordinate scrap drives. All noble work. Or she could take a risk. In recruiting overseas girls, the Red Cross looked for a, quote, certain type of girl. While the State Department decreed that women volunteers could not have a father, son, or brother in the armed services, Red Cross headquarters clarified that good temper, discretion, and self-reliance were essential, and that the women had to be willing to work for nominal salary. Stenographers and other office workers were restricted to approximately ages 28 to 35, so they wouldn't be too distracting for the soldiers, and similar age rules applied to other positions. Preferably, volunteers should also have some knowledge of French or Italian. If you look at this list, this is the perfect job for Alice. So, in March 1918, Alice sailed away to France from New York with three friends, Doris Kellogg, Margaret Davis, and Genevieve Washburn, bound for France and adventure. And can you guess what they signed up to be? Mechanics. Alice and her friends had signed up to join with the American Fund for French Wounded, an organization which she probably learned of through her friends, the Ames family. Once they reached Paris, they realized their role as mechanics was severely hampered by the lack of cars available to the AFFW. If you recalled, I'd mentioned the Red Cross was in charge, and they got the first claim on any available automobiles. After a few weeks, Alice and her friends got a special request. Alice described it in a letter to her brother. The Red Cross asked us if we could assemble a Ford for them. We said, sure, send it along. And the next day they did send it in a box, placed it carefully on the garage floor, and left. We had a lot of fun putting it together, and great was our interest when we got it all set up, cranked it, and it started. We jumped aboard it and ran it around the block, hanging onto the thing with our teeth because there was not a body on it. And the French people looked at us as much to say, "Three crazy Americans." The Red Cross man came over and inspected it, found everything okay, and said that as long as we'd gotten that far, why not go a bit farther and make an automobile out of it? So we took the body off an antediluvian wreck that stood in the corner for months, put it on the new chassis, and then went for another ride. We finished this forenoon. There was nothing else to do, so we took the rest of the day off and went on a spree. We donned our spanking new uniforms, took a taxi and made for the center of town, had luncheon on one of the boulevards, walked out the Champs-Élysées, and then took a fiacre and drove to the Bois. It sounds kind of fun, doesn't it? Like Alice's letters, most of the ones I've read from other Americans in France were typically upbeat. It takes a careful reading to sift through her jolly language to uncover the facts. Listen to this snippet with two halves of your brain. On one side, you'll enjoy her good story. On the other, keep track of her descriptions of the war. The offensive is on again, and everyone in Paris is praying for the Allied armies. Poor, brave fellows. I suppose hundreds of them are dying on the battlefields only 60 miles away. The Huns recommenced with all their fury, and this time hope to gain all that they expected to during their offensive of March. Everyone knows that they won't, but it's going to take time to down them. At 6:30 yesterday morning, we heard the big gun roar, so we knew that the offensive was on because the cannon has not been heard in Paris for 20 days. They continued to drop a shell every 20 minutes for about 3 hours, and then let up till late in the afternoon when they commenced again. Around 11 last night, the sirens shrieked their warning and everyone waited for the Goths to arrive, but they returned back north of the city. So soon after, the all-clear was given and everyone went peacefully back to sleep. This morning, Bertha started again at daylight and has popped 3 or 4 times during the forenoon. The Germans are obviously... Oh, the cannon just boomed again, away off in the distance, sounding like a sunset gun at Fort Snelling. The Germans are trying to break down the morale of the French by scaring the civil population so badly that industry will suffer from it, but they have a long way to go. No one pays any attention to their silly old cannon, and every air raid makes people just resolve to see this war won if it takes years to do it. The Germans are just like animals. They haven't got the spirit of courage or humanity. I wish the Allied Air Force would blow every town in Germany to pieces. I wish I had a little airplane of my own to use on these bright, sunshiny afternoons. Dodie Muggs and I were walking along the Place de la Concorde yesterday morning on our way to the Red Cross, talking excitedly about the offensive when the big gun landed a shell a few blocks away with a bang that must have been heard all the way in New York. Muggs gave one whoop and went 3 feet into the air. An old Frenchman was passing, many in fact, but this one in particular threw back his head and roared. I think it was the first good laugh he's had since the war started, and he went down the street doubled over with mirth. Now, if you were keeping track, that letter referenced hundreds of men dying on a battlefield just 60 miles away, over 24 hours of bombing and over 40 individual bomb blasts, an air raid, and a bomb that fell just a few blocks from her. Yet the whole thing sounds like a party, doesn't it? Alice described Paris this way. The streets are filled with soldiers of every kind, and if you walk along one of the large boulevards at a crowded hour, it makes your head swim and try to keep track of all the uniforms. There are soldiers everywhere, French, English, Scotties, Algerians, Americans, Portuguese, and even a few Russians, and all the color of their uniforms blended into the fresh green of spring. Unfortunately, there were no more cars to fix at the AFFW, so Alice and two of her friends received permission to shift to the Red Cross. They signed up to be cantineers, but served as clerks in the casualty department while they waited for their assignment. In the meantime, the spring offensive began. She wrote to her family. The wounded started to pour into Paris, and in 24 hours the hospitals were crowded to the doors, beds in all corridors, operations going on all day and night, men's wounds being dressed in wards, hallways, or wherever they could get room to lay them. We were sent out to Hospital Number 1, used to be the American ambulance at Nully, just outside of Paris and only 15 minutes from Place de la Concorde, and told to do whatever we could to help. Hospital Number 1 is a huge place with 1,200 beds, and when I saw it filled to the overflow with American and French wounded, I'd wondered that there were any men left at the front to check the Germans. The first morning we reported we were put into a bed-making squad, and I think we made every one of the 1,200 beds. So many of them have been gassed, and I feel almost sorrier for them than I do for the ones that are suffering from gunshot wounds, shrapnel, or otherwise. The gas very often burns their bodies horribly, but always affects their eyes, throats, and lungs. It is unspeakably sad to see these poor fellows doubled over in agony of coughing, and realize what they must be suffering. Soon after, Alice got promoted from bedmaker to auxiliary nurse. She wrote, "Today was our 5th as auxiliary nurses, and I cannot believe what we have done, all that we have done. If you would like to know a few of the things I did today, read the following. Washed faces and hands, made beds for the ones not seriously ill, gave Dakin treatment to men whose wounds were being treated with it, removed dressings from all wounds so that they would be ready for the doctor. Some of the wounds are dreadful, and some not so bad. The Russian has had his leg amputated just below the knee. One man has dreadful head wounds. One has a shrapnel wound the size of a saucer in the middle of his back. One has the calf of his leg shot away. One, a poor young French boy, has a bayonet wound through the abdomen, and I am afraid that he's mortally ill. One has a gunshot wound that enters one side of his body and comes out the other. Most of these men get the Dakin treatment, a system of wet bandages and drains. I assisted the nurse and the doctors with the dressings, bound up all wounds after the dressings, and made the Russians' bed, a slow and painful operation, took all pulses and temperatures, gave them their luncheon, did Lord knows what all afternoon, gave them dinner, and at 6 came home to my own, tired as a dog, but thoroughly satisfied and happy with the work. I would have to have had training and experience in America before I would be allowed to do half of what I did today. But over here, they tell you to do the best you can, and you go ahead knowing that if you didn't do them, no one else would. And I suppose something is better than nothing. I had to hold a man down in bed yesterday, leaning my full weight on his chest and holding his hands down while his wounds were being dressed. It took about 10 minutes, and during the entire dressing, he shrieked with pain, prayed out loud for relief, and called for his mother. In mid-June, Alice and her friends were transferred to a French canteen in Orly-la-Ville. There, her initial job was to work as a canteener, helping to prepare food and serve it to the soldiers headed to the front. The personnel consists of Mrs. Church, the directress, 15 American girls, all volunteers like ourselves, 1 chauffeur, and about 15 servants, cooks, dishwashers, vegetable pairers, scrub women, etc. The canteen is open all day and night, but the big rush comes for dinner at noon and for supper at 5:30. We feed about 1,000 men each noon and the same each evening. The number for breakfast always varies. In addition to the main canteen, where regular full-size meals are served, we operate a place called La Goutte, which means the drop, and is a little booth where the poilu can get hot coffee or chocolate, sandwiches, and hard-boiled eggs at any time of day. The French government will not allow the Red Cross to give things to the poilu free of charge because they say that it is a bad thing for them to get them into the habit of expecting it. So the Red Cross is obliged to charge them a little, but, of course, gives them far more than they pay for. For instance, they pay 2 cents for a coffee, 4 cents for chocolate, and 15 cents for a full meal, consisting of good meat, potatoes, vegetable, salad, which, by the way, they cannot live without, a bowl of soup, a hunk of bread, dessert, which is usually fruit or nuts and raisins or stewed fruit, and a cigarette. The other day, as I watched them, I could hardly keep the tears back. They are so sad. having been fighting for 4 years and are pitifully poor, and most of them leave huge families behind when they go off to the trenches. Many of them get their last good meal before they enter the trenches, and unhappily, many of them have their last meal on Earth in our canteen. We have a phonograph which plays while they eat, and most of them are the happiest crowd in the world. They laugh and sing and always have a pleasant word for everyone. And 20 minutes later, after they shoulder their packs, gas masks, shovels, rifles, blanket rolls, canteen, mount the train, and are off to the trenches. As you would predict, Alice did not report everything she saw and occasionally sugar-coated the difficulties that she faced. She often downplayed the danger, too. Hear what she wrote one night as the shells exploded in the garden beside her rooming house. We had several Boche planes over us lately, and in broad daylight. They're trying to sneak back over the lines and find out where Foch has his reserves massed. It is very exciting to see one in the air, and the anti-aircraft shells popping all around him. They look like pieces of white popcorn against the blue sky. All during the last 2 wonderful attacks and victories of the Allies, we have heard the roar of the guns day and night, more insistent and oftener than usual. It is an ominous sound to go to sleep to, but you get used to it just as you do to everything else in life. Your last letter spoke of us being near the front. Don't worry! No Red Cross girls are ever within shell fire. We are safe wherever we are because people are always looking out for us. And besides, the Germans are going the other direction these days. Alice was likely sparing her family the details both to prevent worry, but perhaps also to cut off any criticism. She had enlisted despite the disapproval of her father. Max wrote that he called and found you all at home and that Dad was still saying I had no business in France. I wish he could see me for about 12 hours out of the 24 and he might change his mind. As you can see, Alice was a keen and observant writer, noting the details of what she experienced and blending in her knowledge of the world. Her letters reveal that she was aware of the momentous times in which she was living. She knew her circumstances were unusual, but I don't think she was aware that she was unusual. This letter to her brother Jack captures a bit of her voice. Jack had been initially rejected by the Army due to poor eyesight and was writing to express his interest in joining with one of the Red Cross or other volunteer agencies. Mama wrote that you were thinking of coming over with the Red Cross, so I thought I'd write you and say how I think things stand over here. All the soldiers seem to have a great respect for the Red Cross, but seem to resent seeing so many young men among the personnel. I think myself that a good bunch of them are slackers, but I also know that a lot of them, like yourself, can show their draft board refusals, but they are not always given the benefit of the doubt, which is not at all fair, but c'est la guerre. I have talked to many wounded soldiers in the hospitals and around about, and they speak the Red Cross men, the healthy ones, as bummies. If you could come over and be sure of getting a real job in the frontline canteen or driving a Red Cross ambulance, it would be worth the racket. But otherwise, I would rather you stay in the U.S. and fill a man-sized job as you are doing. The chances are that if you came over, you would be kept either in Paris, attached to an American base hospital in southern France, or drive a truck for a canteen. We have 2 cars here, one attached to each canteen, but I cannot imagine you satisfied with a job such as our chauffeurs have. Our chauffeur is a good one because, at the present, I am one of them. The driver of the Ford at canteen number 2 went on a spree and was peremptorily dismissed, so I am filling his shoes. Do not yet know whether they're going to send us another man or send me a license, and I don't much care what they do. Here we see some of Alice's contradictions. She's aware that the male volunteers are unfairly perceived as bummies, yet she herself thinks that many are slackers. She values the work at the front as the real job and dismisses those behind the lines, which would include herself. Her claim that she didn't care about getting formal permission to be a driver was pure malarkey, though. A later letter describes her joy at being formally instated as a driver, a position that no woman was supposed to have. Excuse me, there we go. There we go. A position that no woman was supposed to have. I love these letters because they do capture these contradictions, the way these strong, deep, and completely inconsistent ideas snuggle side by side in our minds. There was no conflict for Alice at the time, at least none that we see in these letters. She was a woman of a certain type, confident of her value to the world. The last point, her confidence of her value to the world, that is something to pause and to consider more deeply. Remember that this was 1918. Alice was blessed with education and wealth and an extra large measure of chutzpah, that does not outweigh the central reality of her life. She was a woman living at a time when women had very few legal rights. Most particularly offensive, she did not have the right to vote. Take that in for a moment and appreciate this. Alice and her fellow women went to war to serve a nation that did not treat her as an equal in any significant way, legally or socially. Like many other women volunteers, Alice returned from France proud of her accomplishments and inspired by the example of organized action that she had witnessed. Back in St. Paul, Alice continued with her activism, travel, art collecting, philanthropy, and women's causes. In June of 1919, as the men and women who served in France continued to trickle home, the U.S. Congress finally proposed the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Over the next year, as the states began to ratify the amendment, Alice and her contemporaries must have been thrilled. In August 1920, the amendment finally passed, but Alice did not retire from her political activism. In October, she became the Minnesota chairman of the Organization of Republican Women's National Motor Corps, a title which I always have to say twice because it's such a mouthful. She became the Minnesota chairman of the Organization of Republican Women's National Motor Corps, a group that offered the use of their cars to help mobilize speakers and support electioneering work. She joined the Women's Overseas Service League and argued for greater recognition for the work that she and her colleagues had done. In late 1920, Alice and a group of other St. Paul women met to discuss forming a new club, a social club, a place to socialize, where knowledge, work on common projects, lunch, and relaxing could happen. From this meeting was born the Women's City Club, an organization which Alice was deeply loyal to. Alice had restless feet, however, and continued to be a wide traveler. In December 1921, Alice and her friend Catherine Ordway set sail on a trip for Japan, China, and the Philippines. In 1923, she returned to France with her family. In 1927, she traveled with Grace and Blair Frandreau to Africa, trekking up the Congo River and across land to the eastern coast of Africa. Footage of that trip was turned into a film that was shown nationwide. In 1929, Alice took charge of building a permanent home for the Women's City Club. She led the efforts to choose a site, select an architect, draw up the plans, and raise the money for a clubhouse for the Women's City Club. She completed all of her tasks in the first 2 years of the Great Depression and oversaw the opening of a fashionable and popular club in 1931. Among the many roles she embraced was that of a promoter. In 1931, she helped toss tickets from an open airplane to promote an opera. Throughout the 1930s, Alice continued to travel. A frequent visitor to Florida, she helped to help manage her family's lumber interests. It was during that time that Alice began to visit Captiva Island. She was an early booster and investor in Captiva, where she developed a close relationship with Ding and Penny Darling. Alice was also a conservationist, and her love for the outdoors led her to donate 180 acres of land to the state in honor of her late father, William O'Brien. Today, William O'Brien State Park is one of the most popular parks in the state, and it is certainly a wonderful tribute to Alice. Unfortunately, the St. Paul Women's City Club closed in 1971, a victim of shifting urban demographic and economic trends. A few years ago, the Minnesota History Museum developed an exhibit on World War I. They asked if they could borrow Alice's uniform, so my cousin Robin and I pulled it out. As we examined it, we discovered that a hidden medal pinned to the inside of her pocket. A medal with St. Christopher on one side and an automobile on the other. This little piece of metal captures so much of Alice, doesn't it? Adventure and speed on one side, hope, trust, and faith on the other. So, there you go. See, we're all descendants of this past and all caretakers of our future. May we face it with the courage and the confidence that Alice represented. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So like I mentioned earlier at the beginning of the program, if you have any questions at all, feel free to type them into the chat. And we're going to start moving into the question and answer portion. So let me pull up my screen here. So the first question I have for right now is, how did you learn about Alice's story? What eventually led you to her letters and to writing this book?
Yeah, that's a great question. Cleaning out mom's attic. Dad dies, mom's got to move, you got to clean the attic. So I had heard stories that Alice was in World War One, and what I'd heard was that she was an ambulance driver, and that's sort of a common cultural story that we'll hear. Oh, great aunt served in World War One and was an ambulance driver. There were really very, very, like, none. No, I haven't found one. A woman who actually drove an ambulance for the Red Cross or for any major organization, because those jobs were taken by that first round of men I described who were from Harvard and Yale and St. Paul's and places like that. So men drove the ambulances because they were really literally going to the front. Alice drove, as I described, she drove a truck, which also women weren't supposed to do. But I'm sorry. So I'd heard that she was in World War One. We were cleaning out the attic and we came across the letters, and my mom said, "Oh, those are Alice's letters. Maybe that'd be a good project." And like any daughter, I'm like, "Mom, no way, forget it." And then I thought about it again. I'm like, "Yeah, they are pretty good. Let me think about it." So I started working on them and connected with the Red Cross here, actually in Minneapolis, to ask if they were interested in sponsoring me to do some work on it, and they did. So we got a grant from the Minnesota Legacy Fund. Thanks everyone who has ever paid a tax, because that helped pay for that project. And so I wrote an article that was sort of about women who weren't nurses who were serving in World War One, and that was the article you referenced in the intro. And then the letters stuck with me, so I developed the manuscript of all the letters, and luckily the MHS Press picked it up.
All right. Was Alice driving supplies, soldiers? Like, what was she? Obviously, she was driving around a lot, but to what end?
Yeah, that's a great question. So her letters describe that she would get in her truck, and I was like showing that picture because when you say a truck, we all picture like a modern big pickup truck or something, or like an agricultural truck, but it was really a very small truck. But she would go to market and she would pick up like 90 heads of lettuce and 400 eggs and all the supplies that they had to get from the local market that the French farmers had, or the local supply warehouse that the French army had. So she would go and pick up, twice a day, or maybe just once, sometimes twice a day, these supplies. And then she talked a lot about getting stuck behind a bunch of people marching on the dusty roads and just eating dust for an hour. She's like in her truck slowly trying to get to where she had to go. So once she shifted from being a canteen driver to being a truck driver, that was a pretty firm shift. She was not really working in the canteens after that.
So when she was working as a truck driver, though, she was still working to supply the canteens?
She was still working to supply the canteens, yeah. And the canteens were sort of she was actually working at two different canteens for a while, and like taking the train down, a few miles to work at one, then work at the other one that was closer. But it was a dual canteen. It was run sort of by the French and the Americans for the Red Cross, which was unusual because that was evidence of her good French. There are a lot of letters of people who served in canteens, but they were farther back in the completely American-run military locations, but she was in a French camp.
You mentioned that there was a film made of Alice's time in the Congo. Can you still watch that somewhere? Is that available?
No, it's not available. There's been a couple of copies of it kicking around the family. So I'm her grandniece.
Okay.
And there are a couple of copies of this film kicking around. And it's frankly pretty unwatchable. It's like really boring and really long. It's just evidence of like the standard for entertainment must have been really low back then. So it's silent, with captions, like, and then, we saw the Congo, and then we had some food, and then we saw a lion. It's just incredibly dull. But that was pretty hot stuff back in the 1920s, I guess.
So it wouldn't be worth including in another presentation like this of just
that's a great question. Actually, no, I should have done that. I should. Yeah. No, I've got it. It's really a snooze fest, but you're right. If I showed like 30 seconds, that was really exciting.
No. We're going to do the whole thing. we're committing to this. We're doing the whole film.
Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great idea. Lollapalooza of Alice O'Brien
Yeah.
movie. Yeah.
Like she did all this really cool stuff in France, but we're gonna learn about this one time she saw a lion.
Yeah.
It's gonna take about 2 hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, while Alice and her friends were stationed in France, where did they stay? Were they in hotels, private homes? Did she have like a tent in a park?
It's a good question. The way she describes it, when they were in Paris, they were sort of staying at it. To me, it sort of sounds like a bed and breakfast kind of situation, where they
Hmm.
had like a servant woman who would wake them up and get the fire going and would prepare breakfast for them.
Hmm.
Then they go away and then they come back at night. So that sounds like kind of a bed and breakfast is how I describe it. Later, when she was at the canteen, they were staying in like a little house that they had rented, her and the other Red Cross girls.
So was she able to stay together with the girls that she volunteered with from Minnesota?
Well, unfortunately, so Genevieve Washburn, no connection to the Minneapolis Washburns. She was from Duluth, actually.
Mhm.
Her family in Duluth had sponsored, and this was typical for like the University of Minnesota, sponsored a ambulance, and like the Italian American Society would sponsor an ambulance. And up in Duluth, Genevieve Washburn's family had organized the sponsorship of an ambulance that was dedicated to the American Fund for French Wounded. So Alice and Doris and Muggs were like, there's nothing to do here. Let's get out of here. Let's go to the Red Cross. But Genevieve was kind of stuck there because she had this ambulance coming that she helped sort through. So she stayed with the American Fund for French Wounded, but but Alice and the two others did stay together. Yeah. What's really interesting is that Doris Kellogg wrote, well, she was writing letters home too. And when she got home, her family bound the letters together and published them. And so when I was working on this book, I could compare and contrast what Alice was writing and what
Mhm.
Doris was writing the very same night by candlelight. They're both writing home. And that's where I learned how much Alice was really understating things, because Alice was like, la la la, oh yeah, don't worry about us, we're fine. And Doris was like, oh my God, we had shrapnel hit the garden. We haven't been sleeping for hours. Like, this is really serious. And Alice is like, yeah, I'm fine. I had a little cold. And Doris is like, she was sick as a dog. Oh my God. She was really down and miserable and sick. So luckily, it was a really great opportunity to sort of compare and contrast those two different perspectives.
Yeah, so then you start trying to read into it and be like, well, is this one just being overly dramatic, or is she downplaying it? Or
No, they were all underplaying it. I mean, I think even
okay.
Doris was underplaying it, because, and this was true with the men's, the soldiers. I read a lot of soldiers' letters and a lot
Mhm.
of women's letters, and the men too were just not going to go into it. Part of it was self censorship because they knew that their letters could be censored if they actually said where they were. And so Alice's letters are often written like, August 20th, somewhere in France. And so
Mhm.
somewhere in France is a lot of letters are labeled as that. But there just was not what you did. You just did not terrify your family with stories of all the things.
Mhm. Um, so I hear a lot about women entering the workforce in World War II, and like there was this big push for women to do that. And you touched on it briefly in your presentation, but was there a similar push during World War One, or does even the Red Cross at one point be like, okay, we have too many, please stop volunteering, you know?
Yeah, no, the Red Cross could be picky. I mean, they made all those rules about who they were going to take because there was no other place for women to be really actively involved in the war effort. So they got to be very choosy about their age and their requirements. You had to have letters of loyalty attested to by neighbors saying that you weren't like a German spy and that you loved America, and character references from your priest, all sorts of things like that. Um, the women who came back really put their efforts into the suffrage movement, and um, and I think if we hadn't had the stock market collapse and the crash, there would have been more advancement for women economically at that time. But it's interesting to see these women sort of saying like, "Hey, we were there too. Please acknowledge us." give us credit. We were there too. But when the men didn't have enough jobs, they were like, there's no way we can win this battle now. So they quickly shifted to let's support, the bonus army. Let's support these men and the veterans. I mean, they wanted to support the veterans too, but it was just like incomprehensible to them that you could both support the veterans and support the female veterans.
Right.
It's a bit painful to say, but in the 1970s, the women who were part of the Army Signal Corps, the ones who were actually running the telephones, no, just go because I think we've got time. They had originally hired men for the jobs to run the telephones, and they didn't know what they were doing. And so the American generals were like, get us some women because these men don't know how to connect the lines. So they brought the women over for the Army Signal Corps, and literally, like, I mean, they were like the internet lines. They're connecting the lines to make all the messages go back and forth. And so in the 1970s, those women were identified and recognized as veterans, military veterans who get privileges to be, buried in military lots. The men who were volunteers for places like, well, the male guys who were volunteered to drive the ambulances, they were recognized for their service and could be buried in military plots. But the women like Alice were not. So unfortunately, that's a inequity that still exists.
Besides the uniform that you have from Alice, do you have anything else? Or does your family have anything else from either her time in France or her world travels?
We do have a few things. So what's interesting is Alice had two brothers. One brother, her younger brother Robert, died in a car crash in Florida, in a terrible or actually as a passenger in a car driving along the beach. And then her other brother Jack was my grandfather, and he had four children who all married and had children. So Alice never married; she never had kids of her own. So there's probably like 30 cousins, and there's some albums and some scrapbooks, and my cousin Robin lives in the home that Alice had in Marine on St. Croix. So there's some artifacts there, but yeah.
Now, Alice volunteered to serve in World War One. Did she do anything for World War Two? I know you said that like she continued serving, but
Yeah, so interesting enough, Alice, she was very patriotic. I mean, obviously, she was really proud of her country and really believed in her country. In World War II, she had a houseboat. She became a big boater, and the government took the boat for World War II. They took her on again to help with the military. But at that point, she was an older woman, so she was not really in a position to be serving meals or anything like that. Um, but all of her nephews joined the military, so
and you mentioned earlier one of the requirements for her to join the Red Cross was that she not have any siblings serving. And we
yes.
talked about the one that had the poor eyesight, but what about the other brother?
So Robert, the younger brother, was still he was like 16, so he could not
Okay.
go. But Jack had terrible eyesight, and so she and he both wanted to enlist,
Hmm.
and they saw this rule that a sister could not enlist if the brother was in, um, but a brother could enlist if the sister was in. So it was really quite chivalrous of him. He held back and let her enlist first so that they could both go. And then when he tried to enlist, his eyesight was so terrible that like it took a lot of tries. And then
Hmm.
he did eventually actually get enlisted in like October, but he never shipped out. It was all sort of over at that point.
Okay. Um, I don't think we have any other questions. Are there any other questions that people want to ask? Say we still have some time.
I'd be curious, does anyone have a grandparent or parent who served in World War One and would like to share a brief story about that?
Oop, we have someone.
Actually, my father served in World War One as an ambulance driver in France, and they would go to the front and pick up the wounded and they had to transport them. There was nothing like on MASH, tents up by the front to um, give any comfort or any care. And he had a terrible experience because he said they would just cry, and um, there was just nothing being done for them till they got out of the front for many miles. They might travel all night or all night and all day to get someone to be cared for.
Yeah, that matches what I've read and studied too. It's really heartbreaking. Well, actually, in Rochester, I think you guys would appreciate that sometimes you get the most medical developments and advancements to come from these tragic events. So in World War I, as I mentioned, the Red Cross supplied nitrous oxide. Like, that's a really important job. And they supplied the oxygen. Like, that's a really important job. And what's interesting about the Red Cross is their efforts to handle blood supply happened in World War I because they really just began to understand how to do blood transfusions and then how to do plasma, which is better to just transfer the plasma instead of the whole blood. They were just figuring that out in World War I. So yeah, I'm sure your father saw some really horrible situations.
Yes.
Yeah. Joanne Johnson has her hand up. I'm not sure if that's a question or just like a hey.
Yeah, I asked her to unmute. So Joanne, if you can move your mouse to the bottom of the screen, you should see in the lower left-hand corner, there's like a little microphone symbol. And if you click on that, that should unmute you. Did that work? Well, clearly not, you're still muted.
Yeah, Joan, if you want to pipe in, you can just hit your unmute button. We're ready for you whenever you want.
Or if you can't get that to work, feel free to type something in the chat and I'd be happy to read it. Here we go. All right, Joanne?
Yes.
You raised your hand?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
My sister Ruby, who's on this Zoom, worked for the Bryan family at Marine on St. Croix. So I see her waving now. She lives in Seattle.
Yeah, she was telling us about that at the beginning.
That's just great. I didn't realize that you're coming in from Seattle, Ruby. That makes this a national event. Abby, you've thrown a national event.
Yes.
Way to go, Olmsted County. Yeah, it's great. Ruby and I connected a couple years ago. So it's really fun to hear.
I highly recommend Nancy's book. It's a wonderful read. I've read it twice now. I'm going to have to go back and read it a third time. Alice was really a remarkable woman and a real institution in the Marine area. So glad you've written this book.
Thank you. Thanks.
I'm so glad that my sister told me about this. My sister lives in Rochester, and so that's how I found out about this.
Yeah, it's great.
I shared it. We did have another question come in.
Mm-hmm.
So did Alice ever encounter anyone from Minnesota during her travels?
She did, yeah. So there's a pretty good network of information that was going back. So if she saw a soldier that she knew, or she was writing to men she knew who were stationed nearby, and so they were sort of keeping track of each other, like, oh, I heard so-and-so sick, and oh, I heard so-and-so died, and she had there's a funny story. I don't think I put it in the book, maybe I did, that there was another Red Cross volunteer from St. Paul who was with Alice and then who went back to Minnesota before Alice did. And the parents met with her. I think her name was Daisy or something like that, or Dottie. And they're like, hey, how's Alice? She's like, oh, yeah, Alice is good. No, really, like, how's our daughter? And she's like, oh, she's fine. I think she needs some socks. Like you could send her some socks.
Yeah.
So, the network, like everybody knew. And the letters that Alice wrote, she was writing sometimes to the little brother, the big brother, the parents, her aunt. It was clear that the letters were passed around. Like she knew she was writing to multiple people at the same time. Yeah, there was a big verbal network. She ran into some people from the Twin Cities and talked about it. Yeah.
That does make it easier to send one letter and it just gets dispersed to everyone instead of writing 50 letters.
Yeah. Yeah. The ones she wrote to her little brother at school, she knew were just for him, but the rest were shared in St. Paul.
We did have a comment as well. So Eric Larson wrote a book on the Churchill family in the Blitz in World War II. And they had a daughter who was like Alice. Apparently there were bombs bursting everywhere, but she was still going to parties and yet understood the terror of it all. And this person thinks that young women are another breed. So
They
very
really
different
are.
mindset.
Yeah, they really are. And some of the stories are really they just make you cry. There was a story of a woman up here in St. Paul named Margaret Mclaren, and she went with the Red Cross. She was a canteen and recreational hut person, so her job was essentially to entertain. And she came back and was super involved in the Red Cross, and she volunteered with the Red Cross till she was like 90. But Margaret wrote this letter describing how they would throw dances for the men to try to lift up the morale, and that there were 10 Red Cross girls for 300 men. And she described these guys and how her feet would be bleeding by the end of the night because they kept stepping on her feet, and she would just be exhausted. And she laughed about how they were always flirting with her. And she was like, there's 300 of you. I need to move on here. Like I need to be the cruise director of joy and happiness. And she describes that was just what she was going to do. She didn't really, she didn't enjoy having her feet bruised and bleeding. But she really was trying to comfort these boys. So they were an incredible breed, and so many of them did it for free. They could be paid by the Red Cross, but many of them, a majority of them, refused this small stipend and paid their own way. And they were often wealthy enough that they could go do that. They're educated, they're available, they're wealthy. It's sort of can we imagine Paris Hilton or Ivanka Trump going to go serve in Afghanistan? Can we imagine that?
Yeah.
But that's who it was. It was these upper class women went to do it. It's amazing.
But if there's no other questions, I think we're going to wrap up here.
Okay, I have one. Sorry, I was just putting it in.
Go for it.
What are you working on at the present time? Are you writing another book?
That's a great question. I will show you guys a secret. You have to promise not to tell. I'll pull it up. So this book that I wrote, it was such a long process, and I was in the middle of having children. So it took 8 years to get the manuscript finished and through the process. So I'm doing something shorter. And what I'm doing is an illustrated history of famous Minnesotans. So I'm doing the drawings. You guys may recognize. Any guesses here? Lindsay Vaughn. She's pretty amazing. So I'm creating essentially a coloring book for elementary school kids about famous Minnesotans. So it's pretty fun.
Thank you.
Sure. Nobody knows that. Don't even tell my mom, because then she'll ask about it. And, Yeah.
All right. That sounds very exciting. And then we did have one other comment regarding service in World War I. Paul's grandfather had immigrated to Minnesota about 12 years before the war. He didn't serve, but we have a letter to his nephew from before America got into the war. The nephew apparently considered returning to Germany and enlisting, However, his grandfather counseled him not to, and the nephew stayed here in America.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I'm actually really glad you brought up that story, Paul, because I put a little teaser in there when I talk about how 4 of Minnesota's 10 congressmen voted against war. And as you know, there are a lot of German immigrants who came to Minnesota. So this idea of going to war to fight your cousins was just ridiculous. And there was a lot of loyalty at the time to Germany. So it was really hard. You've probably heard the story about the mayor of New Ulm. I believe was essentially tarred and feathered because he was a German apologist. And there was really a lot of anti-German sentiment, and German was dropped as a foreign language, and people stopped speaking German. And I think probably in your part of the state, there's a lot of stories like this. So it was really awful. And, again, 100 years later, we see the same issue, right? This sort of divided loyalty and not a lot of nuanced respect for the challenges that would cause a family. Yeah.
if there are no other questions.
Okay. Thanks. I'll hang out here for a minute in case somebody has a private question and wants to linger, but I appreciate it, everyone. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, I want to thank both our audience for asking so many great questions and to our presenter for sharing her time and expertise with us tonight. We hope that you enjoyed tonight's program and that you continue to join us in the future as we discuss everything from voting rights to a history of wastewater treatment in Rochester and so much more. Check out our website, olmstedhistory.com, to keep up to date on all of our events and programs. If you enjoyed tonight's program, consider making a donation to help us continue to offer this and other great programs, or consider becoming a member. A History Center of Olmsted County membership offers a wide variety of benefits, including access to free and reduced cost events like this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.